Welcome to session 12, part 3, the one where we smash the Confucian hierarchy in marriage.
So today we want to give an outline to this video because we'll be tackling some scripture in some depth. So next we want to just remind people of the context. We will talk about a biblical theology of marriage from Ephesians 5 primarily because that's where the head-body metaphor comes from, and we want to look at that carefully. We'll be giving a biblical case for egalitarianism, for husbands and wives being equal, not just in value, but in decision-making authority, like in function. And then we'll give some evidence from church history and then reflect on what does this mean for women's vocation and women's voice. It's been a while since we've recorded.
It has.
Things have been busy.
We're back.
I want to bring up an oldie but goodie here. It's only 8 years old, but to introduce this topic, we have this article back from 2016 by Nate Sparks called Injustice, an Open Letter to the Gospel Coalition, which talks about basically sexual spousal abuse, teachings on women, and how that makes women especially vulnerable in intimate relationships. What did we think about this?
It's pretty damning. One part of it that is very concerning is on sexual abuse. In part 1 of Nate's letter, he says, C.J. Mahaney is explicitly supported by TGC and its cohorts. Mahaney has been implicated in what many have called the largest sex abuse scandal to hit the evangelical church. Multiple persons have claimed that Mahaney and his leadership team have worked diligently to actively silence multiple abuse victims within his church. He is even facing a lawsuit from many of these victims. Yet, Kevin DeYoung, Don Carson, and Justin Taylor have openly defended him, with no fewer than 6 presiding council members will share a stage with him at this year's T4G conference. And then Nate asks, how precisely are you caring for the victims when 2 council members of TGC and 1 board member of Desiring God have openly stated that the allegations against him are false?
Wow. So they're playing jury, essentially, and they're running cover for him publicly, or they were. And there was like 5 years of allegations that were coming out, right, of C.J. Mahaney before this. And again, this article is written in 2016. So I think the question we're asking is, to what extent does the theology drive patterns of abuse? Either drive it or kind of passively allow for it or encourage it and things like that. So we've been exploring that in the last 2 videos.
Right. Point 8 in Nate's letter addresses that. He says, in December, Jason Meyer wrote an article titled A Complementarian Manifesto Against Abuse. Within this article, he made several very bothersome claims. First, he claims that women are equal in worth, but have divinely appointed separate roles. I don't know about you all, but the concept of separate but equal leaves a very bad taste in my mouth. Further, Further, he claims that issues of abuse within the complementarian tradition are not due to actual complementarian teachings, but the distortion of complementarianism he calls, quote, hyperheadship. It seems to me ironic that he extorts the values of...
You said extorts. Exhorts.
Oops. Let me...
Although extorts is
not wrong. Oh, no. It seems to me ironic that he exhorts the virtues of complementarianism when Russell Moore himself has stated that your views are not creating effectively complementarian marriages. Instead, people who try to love their spouse as Christ would have them do so, despite their commitment to complementarianism theology, end up in functionally egalitarian marriages instead.
Yeah, I mean, because the hyperheadship understanding of of things of the relationship between husband and wife is that of like owner and property, right?
Hmm.
And there are some that he addresses in this article, and listeners, please link to this article, give it a read, because it is amply like linked or footnoted, and so if
Yeah.
you're wondering about like what is he talking about and what
Hmm.
is this, that he brings the receipts.
Hmm.
So there's some who go back and to say women really ought to be the property of men at all times, right? So
Right.
so a daughter is the property of her father until she gets married and becomes the property of her husband. And
Hmm.
that's part of the hyperheadship. And I think another part that really bugs me, it relates to how we spotlighted in our last video the dynamics of
Oh.
mental health disability and physical disability, because
Mm.
all throughout here there's just an assumption of ability.
Mm.
And when someone gets physically sick, uh, I've seen dementia, kick in.
Hmm.
Like, what the heck happens to your concept of headship, right? Like,
Right.
the relationship has to change.
Hmm.
There's no way that it stays what it was. And
Right.
if there's this rigid hyper headship going on where the idea of the head body relationship gets extrapolated out, and I think
Hmm.
the analogy is totally abused by these people
Right.
to mean some kind of rigid relationship of authority to act, the one under authority, or the owner, or the and property. It's just totally wrong, and it leaves people unable to actually function well when they get hit by like a life-changing event.
Right. And the difference between mental wellness and mental illness is not as clear as someone who has dementia and is bedridden and someone who is going to work and being just fine. There are levels of mental illness that make you not functioning well in human relationships and causing a lot of chaos. And men are vulnerable to that as well as women are. And so, a man who is acting based out of old information, out of childhood trauma, or, I got bullied as a kid and then has certain ways of functioning in the world, is going to be maladaptive with a wife and children, especially when the structure says the wife and children are less than you and you are in charge of them. That's authoritarianism.
And that's what we're trying to address here by making this parallel to Confucianism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very much so. If we say that whatever a man does is right, no matter what, then that becomes kind of a tradition that keeps on going forever and ever and ever, and it's just a hierarchy.
Right. And I think 2 videos ago we cited a paper on the pastoral impact of Confucianism on Korean and Korean American women, where
Christian women,
Christian
yeah.
women, where there's a saying, right? Like, well, if your husband is a rooster, follow the rooster. If your husband is something else, like a dog, follow the dog.
Right, right,
And it's like, is that what a wife has to do?
right. And also, is that fair to men? Is that fair to men? Is that not condescending to think like, okay, well, just follow him. Even if he's hurting you, just follow him. That's not fair to him. He doesn't get to grow. That's not really, we want to say iron sharpens iron. Is that just men?
Right. You're right. If a wife is supposed to be like butter, or
Right.
does butter sharpen iron? No.
No,
So how can there be a sharpening when there's no resistance? Right.
exactly.
So just to remind folks of where we are in this session 12, part 3, we started talking about how the colonial experience of working for-profit companies like the Virginia Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, really skewed Christian faith and all relationships. And we're focusing here on husband and wife, so that every household became a mini plantation with a husband at
Hmm.
the top, right? And
Hmm.
this was to make it really enticing and attractive for men to sail across from England, across the Atlantic, to this totally strange and foreign place to them
Hmm.
and make a profit for investors back in old England. Like, who
Right.
would do that?
Right. It was
Like,
very
what's
dangerous and terrible, and it was all for profit and not for your profit, for somebody else's profit.
right, right. Now, so they were promised land that the king didn't actually have. He had no right giving that land, and you were probably going to have to come into direct conflict with Native Americans. I mean, these are things they knew. But one of the enticements was you could be king of your own castle.
Right.
We've talked about how marital rape as an idea didn't even exist, right? It didn't exist as a law in England or the US until like the 1980s or
Right.
1990s, depending on where you were, what state you were in.
Hmm. I think we have to remember that the whole point of Virginia and Massachusetts as companies was to create little franchises where men were the franchise bosses of each branch of Virginia and Massachusetts so they could make profit corporately for investors who were back in England. This was not because they just loved Jesus so much and they wanted to love the people who were already living in America, the actual Americans, and honor their language and culture as their own and respected what they were doing. This is to make money.
And it was so vicious what happened.
Right. Right.
All right, so let's jump in to the
Yeah.
Ephesians 5. So I want to give a quick primer on what is Ephesians. Ephesians is like pure rocket fuel. It is just got to be one of my favorite books in scripture because it's what you get from the Apostle Paul if you don't come to him with questions, right? Like it's like having him on your talk show and giving him the mic and saying, you just say whatever you want to say, right? And this is his vision for who is Jesus and what is the church and what is our mission together. It's
Right.
Ephesians. So Ephesians can be boiled down to 4 words: sit, speak, walk, stand. And I have to give some credit to Watchman Nee for that. He is a Chinese pastor in the mid 20th century who has a book, Sit, Walk, Stand. But I would throw in speak into that for reasons that you'll see.
Mm.
So chapters 1 through 3 can be characterized by the word sit. Why is that? Because in Ephesians 1:20, Paul says, God seated him, Jesus, at his right hand in the heavenly places. And in 2:6 says, and seated us with him in the heavenly places. So that is sit. Chapters 4 and 5 is walk and speak, walk and speak. So there's this alternation of walking and speaking. I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in 4:1. And then 4:15, but speaking the truth in love. Walk no longer as the Gentiles walk. Speak truth, each one of you, with your neighbor. Walk in love. And then there must be no filthiness and silly talk or coarse jesting, which is negative speech, but rather giving of thanks, which is spirit-led speech. You are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. And then it is disgraceful to even speak of the things which are done by them in secret. Expose the things that are done in the unfruitful deeds of darkness. And then we get to this very important passage. Be careful how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, speaking to one another, singing, giving thanks. And this is Ephesians 5:19. And that is kind of the umbrella statement for the 3 relationships that Paul talks about. The first relationship is wives and husbands, and then children and parents, and then servants and masters. Each of the 3 relationships include very prominently instructions about speaking. So for
Mm.
husbands, the washing of water with the word. For parents, bringing children up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And then for masters, give up threatening.
Mm.
So there's this walk, speak. And this section that we're going to look at is primarily about how do we speak to one another in these relationships.
Hmm.
And then in chapter 6, it's stand. Stand firm against the devil, right? Stand firm, therefore.
Right. So it's like Psalm 1, the beginning of wisdom. How blessed is the one who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers.
Yeah, look at that. Walk,
Yeah,
stand, sit.
right.
Pretty cool.
Right. Well, the way that I've heard people talk about these verses is they're like, see, masters and slaves. So husbands are masters of wives, and wives are masters of children. See, it's the umbrella.
It's the umbrella, right?
See, that's where we get it from. What's wrong with you? That's actually what I've heard.
Well, we'll get to that. We'll talk about that and
Okay. Okay.
why that is not the way to, we're not supposed to compare these relationships one to another
Right.
in ways that are go beyond what is going on here. So
Right. Great.
what's important about this is fallen sinful people use power to silence people who are less powerful.
Mm,
Right? And that is consistent. And
hmm
so it's really important to see that in Christ, the powerful are addressed. They are constrained
hmm
in how they're to use their speech. And
hmm
they're not supposed to block the speaking of other people. In fact, the backdrop in Ephesians 5 is the church as a speaking symphony where everyone gives thanks. Everyone speaks praises to God. Everyone speaks one to another, right? In Ephesians 4, there's the prophetic gifting that's mentioned there. Elsewhere in First Corinthians, that's talked about. But essentially, there is a way that we are supposed to speak one to another. And
mm,
Paul's really concerned about people's voice. And so here in
mm.
this section, we have to be concerned about what is happening to wives' voices or women's voices. And
Right.
what do women have to do with their voices?
hmm And this is, Nate Sparks' letter is concerned about what happens to women at the hands of men, what happens to women and children at the hands of men. And if we're all able to speak with equality as a symphony, no one is more important than the other, everyone sounds different and contributes to a whole, then a perversion of this is something like that fundy baby voice that we've talked about before, Katie Britt's fundy baby voice. She is powerful. She is a senator. She is in one of the co-equal branches of government of the United States of America. But they have her sitting in her kitchen and using this high-pitched voice that is not hers to act like she's helpless. Power and helplessness at the same time, that's not a part of the symphony. That's some sort of helpless act that masks power that is actually hidden aggression. It's not real.
Right. And just for our listeners who don't know, Alabama Senator Katie Britt was the person who gave the Republican response to Joe Biden's State of the Union speech a couple months ago.
Right. And that's a thing. The fundy baby voice is a thing that lots of these women do. Michelle Duggar is one of them, one of the better known of them. It reminds me of this button that I have in my office. It's this big red button, and people are allowed to press it because it's the real button. I'm allowed to press it. Clients are allowed to press it. If you ever got into a place and you're not sure if you're being real, you don't know if I'm being real, you want to press and see what I think, you just reach out and press that big button and we slam the brakes on everything. We say, wait, are we being real? Are we fooling ourselves? Let's check in. And that's what needs to be happening here. Is a funny baby voice real, or is it hiding something? And it's kind of uncanny valley creepy when this is really high pitched voice, like I did in one of the videos where I was trying to be Phyllis Schlafly. That's not my voice. That's not what I sound like. It's really, really
Although she does
creepy.
sound that
She
way.
does
It's
sound, yeah, I was
yeah,
trying to be like her. That's what
yeah.
she actually sounds like. So why did he bring up masters and servants and husbands and wives and all of that if he wasn't trying to be the original weird umbrella diagram maker?
Well, yeah, that's a really important question. I mean, I think it's because yes, there's a pattern of in the culture, the less powerful person is addressed first, and then the
Mm-hmm.
more powerful person is addressed second.
Mm-hmm.
But also these relationships are being sequenced, which is so important. Um, so it's important to point out in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, for example, Aristotle also talks about. So this is a trope, and it's called the household code, right? Like this is in that culture. In Aristotle, the wives, children, and servants or slaves were not addressed at all. I mean, they weren't even given agency. Paul here gives them agency, and this is out of respect for all of the stuff that came before in Ephesians, right? So, and approximately what comes before is in chapter 5, verse 21, submit one to another. That's radical, like right there, submitting one
Mm-hmm.
to another. And there he's still speaking about the whole community, the whole church community.
Right.
Then he applies it and says, wives as to your husbands in verse 22. And the word is added in English, but it's not there in Greek.
Mm.
So there is a umbrella statement, wives as to your husbands, and then husbands also are to be submissive towards their wives,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's still framed that way.
Right.
The only difference for the children parent relationships and the servant master relationships is the word obey is inserted there, but that is, we'll talk about that. That has a different relational quality.
Mm.
Another difference is that Paul quotes the Old Testament for marriage and parenting, but not for slavery. Okay, so kind of a sidebar on slavery. This is really important because there were things in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, about servanthood.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about this in an earlier video. Sometimes in English it is translated slavery. It really should not be, but essentially, he does not quote from the Old Testament because Hebrew Ebed servanthood is not like Greco-Roman slavery. And
Mm-hmm.
it was certainly not part of the original creational design either, right? It was an
Sure. Right.
accommodation to a fallen world, and sometimes things go bad, like there's famine or
Mm-hmm.
disaster, or your
Yeah.
parents, were alcoholics, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
maybe they squandered away opportunities, and so you had to come into someone else's household and live there and serve there, maybe because of uh, poverty, maybe because of you owed a debt. If you stole something, sometimes a typical way to work that off was to actually serve on someone else's
Mm-hmm.
household and farm. And so it was a partial and limited accommodation. But marriage and, sorry, do you want to say something?
I was gonna say something. Yeah. If we're going back to Genesis and thinking about what the original design was, I mean, there aren't even dirty dishes in the garden.
Right.
I mean, forget about alcoholic parents and child abuse and working off your debt. There weren't even dirty dishes because I don't think there were dishes because it was just lovely fruit off trees and you were happy and enjoying animals all the time and the garden. There was no need for slavery. There was no need for hierarchy. That's the original design.
Right. Right. And we'll get to that in Genesis 2 at the end of this video, because and so here it's so important that Paul does quote from the Old Testament regarding marriage and parenting, but not for slavery. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
and so he quotes from Genesis 2 for marriage. He quotes from Exodus 20, the Sinai Law, for parenting,
Mm-hmm.
faith-based context. And then he positions Jesus differently in relation to these relationships, right?
Right.
So for
Right.
folks, please read the text. You'll find in marriage, Jesus is put inside of the marriage. He is within the husband-wife relation, right? He says, like, Christ and the church is within the husband-wife relationship. But that's not the same for parenting. Jesus is the goal of parenting, right? He's kind of stands ready to catch the children as you bring them up, right? Like as parents, you're pointing children to Jesus. And then Jesus stands above and outside the servant master relationship. It shows that, marriage is meant to be permanent as far as this life is concerned. Now, there's
Mm-hmm.
things that could happen there. And divorce is hard, but sometimes it's not the worst thing in the world compared to the options, right? Compared to the alternatives. But slavery is not like that. It's not meant to be permanent. And already we're sensing a difference in how Paul positions Jesus. So
Hmm.
Jesus is above, right, like the master-servant relationship, because he's actually evaluating both, and he's not within it.
Right. I looked that up with you, right? And so
Yeah.
I don't want to like advise people. I can just say I don't want to advise people on their taxes. Please don't listen to me. Never listen to anything I say about
About
taxes
taxes.
because I never know what I'm talking about. But there is a box that's head of household on your taxes. And it doesn't mean that you're in charge and you get to tell everybody what to do. What
It
I
doesn't?
understand, no, the government did not decide to make you the authoritarian head over all the people who are forced to live in your house. Nor would you really want that. I don't think it would make anybody feel very good. It's just a thing for like if you've lost your spouse and you're divorced and you're both heads of household. It's some sort of tax designation. But you're not the head as in like in charge and telling everybody what to do of your wife or of your children. That's not how it works.
Yeah. I looked that up, and Haley, thanks for educating me about this because I
Oh,
never
was I
really
right?
understood that.
Oh,
I just
good.
my wife and I just took turns as marking ourselves on that. So maybe
So you
we're gonna get in trouble. But
no, as I understand it, it doesn't affect anything. It's just and it's a common mistake that people make because 'cause they're like, "I'm the head. Who's the head here?" "Who's in
ah,
charge?" You know, "Who
well,
who who's the head guy here?" So, we wanna have an answer to that question.
who do we come after if you're not fully paying your taxes, right?
Sure, but legally, I can't be like, "Well, he checked the box, so not my problem." No, I'm liable too. That's not how it works.
Hmm. And even from a biblical standpoint, what is the vision of Christian ethics? I think it's really important that Paul does not say that I as the dad of my kids, I don't have a head body relationship with my kids. Right? Like that is not what's going on. And he could have said things like that. He could have just taken this Roman model of the household, which is called the patria potestas, the authority,
Mhm.
the power of the father over everyone in his household. Like he could put
Mm.
people to death in his household and from a civic perspective be totally within his rights, right? Because everyone just belonged to that. That's what it means to be head of household in the ancient Roman sense. Paul
Yeah,
does not use terms like that, right? Like there's a head
right,
body relationship of union
right,
between husband and wife, but not to everyone else.
right. As someone who learned Latin and like a lot of Latin, I took a lot of years of Latin in high school and middle school even. You can't learn Latin without learning Roman culture because no one speaks Latin anymore. And so if you want to use words, you can't use modern words. You have to use only the words that they had in this time. And that's just how it goes, right? And so you end up learning about the structure of families and how society work because that's the only way to learn to read the language beyond, mythology. So it I recall reading the Bible for the first time years after I finished studying Latin and thinking, this is so different from what I learned in Latin class. What Paul is saying is like, oh, I have value too. I never thought that I had to regress into the hierarchy of Roman culture until I encountered complementarianism churches. And I was like, oh, they say that I'm different but equal. And so then it's really confusing and gross, but it's just patriarchy and it's just going back to all that Roman stuff.
That's fascinating. Yes, right. And that's part of what we're arguing here is when we say we're smashing the Confucian hierarchy,
Yeah.
it's not that someone from Confucius's school came from China and came to the US and taught us
Right.
this
Right.
stuff.
We're saying
It's
that
just
this is like a tale as old as time. Everyone does this.
right. And there are certain just, similarities that happen in society partly because of biology,
Yeah,
and partly because men use their strength to dominate, right? And so the
absolutely.
idea, so That's primarily how we're talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what does this word submit mean?
Does
Yeah.
it mean that I have to do everything you tell me, Mako, because you're a man and I'm a girl?
Are you playing an age thing too? Like I'm a man, but
Oh, I'm younger than you.
well, that
I
is one of the
think
Confucian relationships.
it is. It is. Yeah.
It must get really messy if you're older than me, but I don't know. Well, we had come across an article in Christianity Today. They published a very good piece by Murray Vassar, who's
Mm-hmm.
critiquing Wayne Grudem, right? So Murray Vassar is coming from the egalitarian camp, and Wayne Grudem is representing the complementarian camp.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to remember that Wayne Grudem has published a textbook on systematic theology that's like the
Mm-hmm.
best-selling textbook, right, in the US on.
Well, when I went to church a long time ago, people were like, if you want to learn anything about God, you have to read Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology. And they were so weird about it that I didn't buy it because I was like, there's no way this is going to end well. I'll listen to you talk about it, but there's no way I'm buying this book.
So he looks into the Greek usage of this and compares it to other literature,
Hmm.
like outside of Ephesians, which is really
Yeah.
great. Haley, could you read some of this?
Yeah. In Ephesians 5:21, Paul instructs Christians to submit to one another. These words have traditionally been understood to require mutual submission, even among family members. The reformer John Calvin, for example, acknowledged that the notion of a father submitting to his child or a husband submitting to his wife might seem strange at first glance, but he never questioned that such submission is indeed what Paul prescribes. In more recent years, however, this reading of Ephesians 5:21 has been called into question, ironically, in the name of theological conservatism. Many evangelical scholars now assert that the submission in this verse is not mutual submission, everyone submits to everyone, but one directional submission to those in authority, some submit to others. The most outspoken proponent of this view is Wayne Grudem, a prominent theologian who helped establish the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Grudem, who recently announced his retirement from teaching, has argued for more than 3 decades that Ephesians 5:21 could be paraphrased as follows. Quote, those who are under authority should be subject to others among you who have authority over them, end quote. On Grudem's reading, this verse requires a wife submit to her husband, but it does not in any sense require a husband submit to his wife. In defense of this interpretation, Grudem appeals to the meaning of hypotasso, the Greek verb translated, quote, to submit or to be subject. Grudem claims that this verb, quote, always means to be subject to someone else's authority in all Greek literature, Christian and non-Christian, end quote. In every example we can find, Grudem contends, when person A is said to be subject to person B has a unique authority which person A does not have. In other words, hypotasso always implies a one-directional submission to someone in authority.
I love how Murray Vassar is saying in the name of theological conservatism, because the Wayne Grudem is not conserving
Mm,
anything.
hmm.
He is innovating, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I do not use the theological conservatism to describe Wayne Grudem. I just say patriarchal, and that's the innovation
He's being
because
progressive, you mean?
he's being progressive. Like
Such a progressive. That's what I'm going to tell people. I don't listen to Wayne Grudem. He's too progressive
he's
for
still
me.
progressive.
It's true. It's so true.
It is.
It's not what they
Let
mean.
Yeah, so let me give the examples that Murray Vassar gives. He says the problem with this argument is that the claims about hypotasso are simply not true. And Vassar gives 8 ancient passages containing the verb hypotasso. Each refutes Grudem's claim. In all 8 passages, hypotasso is used to describe submission to people who are not in positions of authority. So here's some really important ones. Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century says that every member of a monastic community, a Christian kind of community off to the side that has a dedicated vocation. Sometimes they're in the wilderness, countryside. Sometimes they're in increasingly in urban centers. He says, these monastic communities should consider himself a slave of Christ who has been purchased for the common need of the brothers and should thus submit to all, hypotasso, to all. Right? That's important
Right.
because it's he's not talking about like only to the person above you in some kind of hierarchy.
Right.
It's not that. Here's another example, also in the 4th century, Archbishop John Chrysostom, who is Archbishop of Constantinople, right? Like the capital of the empire.
Right.
That's where he is. This is like the Washington Cathedral of
Yeah.
the Roman Empire of the day. Says that the bridegroom and the bride who have not had prior experience with other sexual partners will submit to one another in marriage, right? Relating to their sexual intimacy.
Mm.
And then also, here's a third example, talking about mutual submission. John Chrysostom considers how we should treat a fellow Christian who has no intention of reciprocating. Quote, but he does not intend to submit to you. Nevertheless, you submit. Not merely obey, but submit. Entertain this feeling towards all as if all were your masters. Now, we could talk about what he means by that and so on, but from a language standpoint, he is using hypotasso in precisely the way that Wayne Grudem claims does not happen. Right? So
Right.
either Wayne Grudem is ignorant or lazy or lying.
Right. So when I think in one of our earlier videos, we've talked about how work and I've mentioned how my husband has worked a lot of hours. So in a lot of these early years of raising little kids, I was alone in the evenings and I am bored and I'm not going to watch TV because, well, we didn't have TV. And what I did was I listened to sermons while I cleaned the kitchen and folded laundry. I listened to probably hundreds to thousands of hours of John MacArthur sermons because they were available in online easily. They were all right there, and they were also in an app, and finding somebody else was not really a thing because the internet wasn't as good as it is now. Or maybe I just didn't know as much and YouTube wasn't as much of a thing. So I've never heard all of this about the early church and all of the hundreds of thousands of hours of John MacArthur sermons that I've listened to.
Well, don't get me started on why that is. Because,
Right.
to be Protestant, Protestant evangelical is, okay, I'm speaking a little hyperbolically, but it is to be arrogant. It
And you
is,
say that as a Protestant
and
too.
I say that as a Protestant
Right.
evangelical. It is, and it's not uniform, of course, but in general, because we have this view of church history that goes like
Mhm.
this, right? Like, well, Jesus, and
Mhm.
then the apostles, and then somehow we got the Bible.
Mhm. Somehow.
Somehow,
Somehow we got the Bible.
somehow.
There it is. Inerrant. Magic.
And then right after that,
Mhm.
there was this massive falling away from the true faith
Mhm.
that only, Martin Luther brought us back from.
Yes.
And then John Calvin perfected it.
Mhm.
And so the Puritans in England pick up from him and then
Mhm.
come over to North America. And we are living in like the greatest, most faithful, most
Mhm.
biblically accurate
Mhm.
version of Christian faith.
If
Even
only
though the early
those
church actually abolished slavery and did all these things, and right, so that's why I
Mm.
say to be Protestant evangelical very often is to be arrogant, is to approach the Bible as if we were the only. There's something magical about us that makes us the best readers and interpreters of the Bible. We don't
Mhm.
have to pay attention to anyone who lived closer to the time of Jesus or
Mm.
the apostles. We could just open this book and know what it means.
I think you're saying as well that it's to be ignorant and then arrogant. You don't, I mean, what you just described about how people learn about faith is precisely what I learned in churches. So I didn't know that all of this existed. I mean, I knew that there were people who were Christians, but that is the sum total of what I knew. And then people were like, well, you don't need to know anything. We know it all. Remember Martin Luther and me? I'm here. Listen to me.
That's right. And that is on display in the way John MacArthur and Wayne Grudem talk about the head-body relationship and hypotasso and what does this word mean to submit?
Right, right. So we're going to keep going in the article. Grudem's interpretation of Ephesians 5:21 is thus founded upon a misunderstanding of the Greek verb hypotasso. As illustrated by the passages cited above, this verb is not only used to describe submission to people in positions of authority, it is also used to describe submission to neighbors, to brothers, and to wives. Moreover, using Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, a massive digital library containing essentially all of the extant Greek literature from the ancient world, I have examined every citation and allusion to Ephesians 5:21 prior to AD 500. I find no evidence that the Greek-speaking church was even aware of the sum to others interpretation defended by Grudem. Paul's words in Ephesians 5:21 are uniformly understood by the ancient Christians to require submission to everyone in the community, regardless of rank, and are thus routinely associated with passages such as Mark 10:44, be a slave to all, and Galatians 5:13, be slaves to one another.
Well, see, I'm not surprised that Grudem does this and says this because he wants to go back and rewrite the historic doctrine of the Trinity too, which we
Mm,
also talked about
mhm, mhm,
in other videos where he wants to say the Son was
mhm,
all eternally subordinate to the Father, that the
mhm,
Father-Son relationship is an example of a power hierarchy from all eternity.
mhm.
Oh gosh, it
Yeah.
is not that. That is not how we are to understand the Trinity.
Right. For example, immediately after quoting Ephesians 5:21, Chrysostom gives the following exhortation to mutual submission. Let there be an interchange of slavery and submission, for thus there will be no slavery. Let not one sit down in the rank of free and the other in the rank of slave. Rather, it is better that both masters and slaves be slaves to one another. Notice that in expounding Ephesians 5:21, Chrysostom uses the language of Galatians 5:13, be slaves to one another. While these two verses are routinely associated in the Greek patristic literature, Paul's English readers often miss the connection. English Bibles typically render Galatians 5:13 as serve one another, but Paul's language is stronger than this translation suggests. The Greek noun for slave is doulos, and the verb used in Galatians 5:13 is the cognate douleo, which means to be a slave.
Yeah, the important thing here is that these two verbs, douleo and hypotasso, are almost synonyms, like they're near synonyms. Douleo
Mhm.
is probably stronger.
Mhm.
And so there's four passages where not in the Bible where the verb hypotasso is paired with the verb douleo, and and it's a one to another logic, right? It's
Mhm.
not, hey, there's this hierarchy, so the words only apply in the direction if you're looking up and you're serving the person higher than you. No, it's actually one to another, not some to others.
Mhm.
So the next major question is like, okay, so if if submit means that, it can go both directions. So then what about the head body analogy that Paul uses in verses 21 or 22 onward? And I want to begin to unpack that for our viewers. First of all, what are analogies, right? Analogies are limited ways of understanding and highlighting something, but not emphasizing others or not including everything in the analogy. So they're limited. For example, Jesus said, I'm the vine, you are the branches. That's John 15. What does the analogy mean there? Right? It means union. It means connection. Does it
Mhm.
mean that Jesus and we as his followers are an actual plant? Like, well, no, of course not. But here's another twist on it, right? Like I've heard at least one person say that we can be passive as because branches are passively there in the vine. So there's an old phrase I don't hear it used much now, but like let go and let God. Well,
Mm,
and
mm-hmm,
in this particular connection, right? Like
mm-hmm,
we're just Jesus holds us passively. Actually, no, like that's not
mm-hmm.
what it means. It just means that we are connected to him and him to us. Does not mean that we are plants, and it does not mean that we should be passive in some way.
Well, that's really relevant for marriage then, because a lot of what's preached at women is exactly that. Just let go and let God. God is ahead over your husband, and he is going to make everything get better. You don't even have to do anything. Why would you try and do something? That's actually wrong for you to do something. You're stepping outside of what you're designed to do. So you're saying that we're stretching the analogy way beyond where it was supposed to.
That's right. Because the reason why Paul uses the analogy in the first place is he explains it, right? Like
Mm,
the stress again is union and connection.
hmm
All of the other possible meanings of the analogy have to be read into it. Things like initiating and receiving, or
mm,
authority and the one who's ruled over, or someone who's more moral and less moral. Like
hmm
that's not how he uses the head body
Right.
analogy. Let's think that through, because there are some, and I'm not sure if John MacArthur or Wayne Grudem says this, but who says that the wives need to unconditionally obey their husbands, right? Like because of this phrase, as unto the Lord, right? Submit
Right.
as unto the Lord. And it's like, look, I mean, the issue is not going to be solved by the grammar. It's solved by the logic. Because if a
Mm,
husband is not following Jesus, then does she have an unconditional responsibility to follow him, or is it to follow Jesus? So, we could talk as a parent and also as just a disciple and as a member of a larger church body. So, as a parent, 1 Corinthians 7 answers that question. If a Christian wife wants to disciple her children to know Jesus, even though her husband does not, like if he's a pseudo Christian,
mm,
or just if functionally an unbeliever, then she is instructed by Paul in 1 Corinthians 7:14 to do so anyway. It says
mhm,
she is to sanctify them, right? Or Paul says they are sanctified. But what that means is she's teaching them. And
mm,
so, the Sinai covenant in the Old Testament called for Israelites instructing their children. How much more is that true for the new covenant in Jesus? And
right.
in 1 Corinthians 7:15, if he chooses to leave for this reason or some other reason, like abandonment, then she's to let him. But that
Mhm.
doesn't make her responsible for his leaving. No, she's just called to follow Jesus.
So if a husband is abusing his wife, this is another example. She needs to report him to authorities, church authorities. You can call law enforcement if that would help if your life is in danger. You should absolutely do that. We have Matthew 18:15 through 20. If a husband's in sin because he's abusing his wife, then the church needs to intervene to help her so she can be safe. And if they don't do that, then they're in sin. They are not being subject to Christ. They're not loving her.
Right. And abusing more than potentially her, although these are horrible situations to
Hmm
envision, right? But I think it's worth mentioning, like abusing their children. Or I recently learned about a woman who divorced her husband because he did not stop watching child pornography, and
Oh,
it was a problem, right? Like that. And the more we get into these kinds of issues where there is there's an indirect cost that the wife is bearing, but a direct cost that someone else is bearing,
mm,
then this is a challenge.
So it's not this passive thing, being a vine in the branch, being a wife of a husband is not something where you just need to let go and let God, be passive, pray, like power of a praying wife, just pray for him and somehow magic thinking he'll get better. You have recourse. ought to be a community who is looking out for you, because sometimes someone's going to hurt you and they're going to keep doing it. And you need more than just you to stop that from happening. And God cares about the weak. He cares about people who can't get themselves out of dangerous situations. And that's the point of having community. That's the point of Christian community, to take care of each other.
That's right. And so, the sanctity of marriage, of course, there's a sanctity to marriage, but it's not a rubber stamp or a veil that is
Hmm.
placed over a bad situation just
Hmm.
because you want to keep believing that this couple, the husband and wife, are just okay, right? Like
Right.
they're doing fine or they will be fine.
Right. Right.
Well, no, I mean, they're placed in relationships with other people so that, as we said before, like iron may sharpen iron, like that, so
Right.
that other voices can come in and also help. So, and
Right.
just, if anyone has any doubt about how serious abuse is, I mean, if you look at the Sinai Covenant and the situations where people are physically abused,
Hmm.
or physically harmed, bodily harm, including servants, the ebed, the Hebrew ebed servant, that is sometimes translated slave, wrongly so. But if there is some kind of lasting physical abuse, like that person goes free. If there is a grown child who is in danger of inflicting bodily harm on his parents or her
Hmm.
parents,
Right.
that was the death penalty as far as the Sinai Covenant was concerned, right? And so if those relationships are important, how much more important is marriage?
Hmm. And what about friendship? What about being connected to each other? What about love? I mean, we're talking about how, in worst case scenario, a Christian community and any societal community ought to protect the most vulnerable, which assumes some level of like passivity, that people aren't able to help themselves against an abusive person. What
That's
about
right.
being married and being friends? We- We're not even getting to that point when we can't do protection of the vulnerable.
Right. And being friends with a married couple, even if you're a single person.
Yeah.
Like, what is that? What is it? What are we called to? Paul's vision of the church in Ephesians 5 is of a speaking community. It's a
Mhm.
singing community.
Mhm. So what's the purpose of this analogy? We said what it can't mean. It
Yep.
can't mean a hierarchy. It can't mean that somebody's passive and the other person has all of the agency. It means a union
Mhm.
and mutual love.
That's right. I think there are those who say, well, does head mean authority or does it mean source?
Mm,
And that question is interesting. I actually think I'm unusual among egalitarians, I think, because I actually think it means both,
mm,
but I don't think that answers the basic question. And it is, folks, if you're listening to this, please tune into the next video because we will look at what does head and headship mean in 1 Corinthians 11, probably the
right,
most tricky of the passages. But it again, it is not what does headship mean in every way, in every place it's used. It's how is the head body analogy applied to the marriage of husband and wife, right? And it's
right,
union, uh,
right,
as we've been saying, and specifically from the husband standpoint, right? It means not accusing his wife and not separating from her, not drawing apart from
right,
her
right,
emotionally. It's always seeking to unify and to understand, because that
right,
is how Christ comes into to his people, the church, and how Christ speaks to the church for her to
right.
nourish.
Well, you can't have a head without a body. Go ahead and try. It won't end well. You need a body and you need to be clued in to the signals of that body so that your head can be okay.
I'll give an example.
Okay.
The there was a time where my wife's brother was having liver and kidney problems, and essentially dialysis was an option, but not a good one because his job involved a lot of travel. So the next question was, well, should my wife Ming or anyone else in the family think about donating a kidney.
Mm.
And for different reasons, their mom and dad were not good candidates. And then Ming herself, it's possible, but she had a splenectomy when she was in high school. She gave birth to each of our two kids by C-section. So this would have been a fourth major surgery for her. And I just said, no way. Like, you've had enough. And so I'm basically the one who gave my kidney to my brother-in-law. There are also considerations of me being male and my kidney being, I'm a larger person, so the capacity of the kidney was
Mhm.
higher. What that meant for my recovery for 2 months was pretty significant, like, because they cut through my abdominal muscles. So I was really weak,
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
weak. It really tired because holding my upper body up was then my back muscles, not my core
Mm.
muscles. So just exhausted, couldn't hold anything heavier than my laptop, couldn't hold my kids who were
Mm.
so Ming had to do all these things, had to be in like totally kind of running my life,
Mm.
offsetting so many things for me. And I wonder again how ability and disability fits into the conversation for the hyper headship people, right?
Mm.
Because what could I do? Like, not much. And, even after that point, there were, concerns that Ming had for my diet and level of exercise, where she was like, I want you to do a little more. Like, and we needed to do more as a family
Mm.
because once you have one kidney, I mean, you have to take really good care of that kidney.
Mhm.
But she took the lead in a lot of initiating diet changes,
Mm.
poking me about exercising and so on. Once again, like, I am really grateful for that.
Mm.
And that is not interference with our relationship. Our relationship is a head body relationship because of our union, right?
Right.
Like, and it doesn't mean anything else than it's a union.
Right. Right. Well, and my illustration of this is sort of everything in our previous video when my husband was in that, right? And what I had to do was say over the course of time in regards to very many different things, like, hey, buddy, you are not pulling your weight and going to work. Great, bare minimum. I need you to step it up. And if I'm going to work, then I need you to be as good of a parent as I am. And he was like, well, I can't do that. And I'm like, well, you're going to have to learn. And so he did. And we are friends and we are partners and we enjoy the company of each other. And we have a great life of equals where we can collaborate on calendars and who's going to take who where and how will we manage these challenges that life throws at us, which makes us better friends and makes us better partners and makes us better in everything that we do. We're better parents, we're better employees, we're better community members. Everything is better because of this.
And I was really touched by that interview that we did last time because neither of you are holding each other to some kind of expectation of you must be better at me than such at doing X, Y, and Z necessarily, right? Like, that
Mhm.
you're in it together. And so I want to contrast that with this joke that N.T. Wright and Elaine Storkey have this friendship. I was sitting next to Elaine Storkey at she's a theologian in the UK, and N.T. Wright is also a theologian, historian of the New Testament. And there's this joke that both of them have told independently. So I think it comes out of partly their friendship, but
Mhm.
that there's a phrase, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. Hopefully that does not mean God loves you and has a terrible plan for your wife, right?
Ouch.
Right. And you know, the because that would fly in the face of what Paul's teaching here. I
Mm.
think if anything, this is a warning that a husband cannot treat his wife as an obstacle to something else that
Mhm.
that he wants whether it be fame or higher pay, or like it, just to ignore her gifts and calling from God, because Jesus doesn't treat the church as an obstacle, right? Like he doesn't want something besides the church. He wants
Mm-hmm.
the church. He wants to be united with the church. And so
Right.
there's this guarding of the priority of marriage. Marriage comes before any other human relationship that we have. And I'm really touched by the fact that African people who were enslaved in North America by European colonizers argued that, hey, they're married and marriage has to come before slavery, right? So Lisa
Mm.
Bowers in her book, African American Readings of Paul, totally touches on this. The enslaved people in Virginia actually wrote a letter to the English bishop and said, like, hey, our enslavers are interfering with our God-given responsibilities
Right.
to one another as husbands and wives, and also as
Right.
parents and children. They are
Mm-hmm.
breaking us up. They are separating our families. How can we be faithful to God when we get interfered with like this? That was part of their argument for abolition.
Right. Well, an example of this, and we've touched on this before a little bit in our episode on rest, and a little bit in the previous episode, I think, was that well, me asking my husband earlier when he was working a lot and for a company that really was quite abusive in how they
Mm.
impose on their employees' time, saying like, I don't think this is right. I don't think this is what I want. I don't think it's what you want. Can we please figure out a solution for work for us that is not taking advantage of us? And that's prioritizing marriage, but calling back to the name of this whole series, Plantation Capitalism, the plantation does not prioritize the sanctity of marriage, because do we have policies that prioritize people's maternity leave, paternity leave, time home with their kids? Are people having to work 2 and 3 jobs and gig work to make ends meet? No, we're not prioritizing families at all. We are not focusing on the family at all.
That's right. And because if we were, we would do things like have a 4-day work week, right? So that
Right.
people can rest,
Mhm.
date. And that is such an important point. And again, like I think what Ephesians 5 does mean in prioritizing marriage among other human relationships also breaks a Confucian hierarchy, at least in my Japanese culture, right? Where once my mom was getting to know Ming, and this is right before we got married, she wanted to tell Ming harshly to go back to law school and make more money. Ming had turned down Harvard Law School to do
Mm.
campus ministry work, and eventually she would go on to get a master's in social work and become a therapist. But at
Mhm.
the time, my mom wanted her to go back to Harvard Law School or something like
Mm.
that and just make a ton of money. And
Mhm.
I said, Mom, you know, if you want to raise that as a question, a polite question, then okay. But if you speak in the tone that you just spoke to me in,
Mhm.
then we're going to leave. We will not stay at your house. We'll get a, like hotel. Um, and I'm going to have to draw a boundary, between
Mm.
you and Ming.
Mhm.
So that's what it means to prioritize a head-body union.
Yeah.
So I want to highlight just 2 quotes from church history, and this is the next part: evidence from church history of the egalitarian view. The first
Mm.
comes from Irenaeus of Lyons. He was Bishop of Lyon. It's pretty key that this is a bishop in the second century. He's probably the most important second century Christian writer. He was mentored by a guy named Polycarp, who was mentored by the Apostle John, like the
Mm.
guy who wrote the Gospel, the
Mhm.
Revelation, and the first, the 3 letters.
Mhm.
So this is Irenaeus, right? Like 1 degree of separation from the Apostle John, 2 degrees from Jesus.
Yep.
And
Yep.
he was answering this question about, like, who's the stronger person, Eve or Adam? And
Mm.
did the serpent attack Eve because she was weaker? He says this, uh, no, I reply, on the contrary, that she was the stronger, since she appears to have been the helper of the man in the transgression of the commandment. For she did by herself alone resist the serpent, and it was after holding out for a while and making opposition that she ate of the tree, being circumvented by craft. Whereas Adam, making no fight whatever, nor refusal, partook of the fruit handed to him by the woman, which is an indication of the utmost imbecility. Oh,
One more time for Wayne Grudem, please. No, just
yes.
kidding.
Eve was the stronger. She held out longer.
Oh.
She debated the serpent at least.
Mm. What do you think about that? Insert any guys who are saying the opposite right here. What do you think about that? The
Right.
guy who is 2 degrees of separation away from Jesus says that Eve was a stronger one.
Yeah, it's almost as if Jesus said that and he's just passing it on. And we'll get to Genesis 2 in just a minute.
Mm.
But let me first read a second piece of evidence from early church history. John Chrysostom, Archbishop of Constantinople from 397 to 407. He is considered to be one of the greatest preachers and biblical exegetes ever. He said, "Wherefore you see, she, Eve, was not subjected as soon as she was made, nor when he, God, brought her to the man, Adam. Did either she hear any such thing from God, nor did the man say any such word to her. He said indeed that she was bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, but of rule or subjection he nowhere made mention unto her." See, that's really important because
Mm.
people who make the case that because Adam was first and Eve was second, that makes Adam greater and Eve lesser.
Right.
Like in at least in terms of function, everyone will say no, they're equal in terms of like worth and value and things like that. But
Mm-hmm.
but no. And then the other thing that John Chrysostom is saying is when God wants something to happen, he decrees it first, right? He says, "Let there be light," and then there's light. He says, "Abraham and Sarah, you're going to have a son," and then they have a son. God acts by speaking, so much so that in Amos 3:7, scripture says, "Surely the Lord God will not do anything except that which he says to his servants, the prophets." In other words, he speaks to someone first,
Mm.
and then he does it. So where is it
Mm.
said that Eve is subjected to Adam? It's
Mm-hmm.
not from creation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not even Adam says that. He says, "No, you're my equal, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh."
Mm-hmm.
In Genesis 3, John Chrysostom continues, "But when she made an ill use of her privilege, and she who had been made a helper was found to be an ensnarer and ruined all, then she is justly told for the future, your turning shall be to your husband." And we will expand on that
Mm.
in another actually set of videos that we are dreaming about now, a long repentance focused on women's issues.
Right.
But what this means is it is not it you could say it's from the fall, but it is not from creation.
No, it's not. It would be different if it came from creation and God brought Eve to Adam and he was like, I got you a present. Adam was like, oh, someone who I'm in charge of, just like the animals. That's not what he said.
That's right.
He
What
could
did
have
he say,
said
Haley?
that, a bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. I don't say that about deer and squirrels. I love them, but I don't say bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. He knew she was him. And God was like, hold on, man, she's an animal and you get to be over her. He didn't do any of that. He could have said that then.
Yeah. Well, there's this phrase, God says, "She will be a helper."
Hmm.
What about that? Doesn't that mean to be less than?
Oh, yeah, doesn't it? That's what I've heard. You're just a helper. I think that's what Debbie Pearl on one of our previous episodes. I have been created to be his helpmeet. I'm not a human in my own right. I was created to help him. So, what is a woman? Am I created to be somebody's helpmeet in the same way that, like, a kid can be hired to be a mother's helper, which is different from babysitting? We all know that babysitting, parents leave, mother's helper, kids stay and get told what to do by mom who's still there. Does it imply some sort of like I'm underneath, the control? No, it means an ally, a military ally, someone who is next to you, working in the same direction, has the same goals. It's an
can even,
ally.
yeah, can even deliver you out of a bad situation.
Sure.
Yeah,
That's the
God,
point.
right, right. God had said in the Psalms, I am your helper, O Israel.
Well,
So,
okay, so Adam came first. So is he in charge of all of me?
no, because in Genesis 1, creation gets better and better, right? Like until
Hmm.
on day 6, God creates humans, male and female, and then day 7 is like the rest, where
Mm-hmm.
God sits on his throne and says, "It is very good."
Mm-hmm.
The completed whole is awesome. In Genesis 2, it would be really weird if we're supposed to read in reverse,
Mm-hmm.
right? That, oh, wait, now Adam was created first, but Eve was created second, so therefore she's lesser than.
Right.
Actually, it goes the other way, right? Like
Right.
creation still is getting better and better. We're still in that trajectory.
Right.
And we could see that based on the words used. God says, like, or Genesis says, God formed the man like a potter forms clay. That's the same
Mm.
word. But
Mm-hmm.
when God fashioned Eve, the word fashioned is like what an architect designs, how an architect designs a building, or how
Mm.
God and the best artists and craftsmen of Israel together fashioned the tabernacle and the temple, right? There's like
Mm-hmm.
an order of magnitude difference in better in terms of
Mm-hmm.
beauty and complexity.
Right. Well, I mean that biologically that is women are more biologically complex than men and that visual of like how a potter forms clay and making clay is actually really hard to do. If you just go out and get dirt and try and make clay, it's not going to go very well unless you know what you're doing, but it is very different from doing the architecture and the curation of materials to build something that's a lot more complex than clay.
That is right. And I just think if we think about God as a life giver and how much more a woman's body is designed to be life giving
Mm, mhm.
than a man's. Of course, a man's is involved in the life
Mhm.
giving, but
But
look,
not that much.
not that much. It's embarrassingly little, I know. The
Y'all didn't do very much.
right. And to say, God is a being whose strength serves the life-giving, the love
Right.
nurturing. Like, isn't that who God is? I don't
Right.
think it works the other way around, right? Like his
Mm,
life-giving and love-giving does not serve his strength. Like you'd
right.
have to be kind of perverse to say
Mhm.
that. No, it's the other way
Right.
around. And so doesn't it make sense that God designs Adam and Eve in this way? And then Genesis 2 ends with your bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, which is, the reason why every man leaves his father and mother and joins to his wife, which is to say
Mhm.
also that every husband and wife become equal to every other married couple before them, including their own
Mhm.
parents, right? This is
Right.
the amazing egalitarian quality of Genesis 2.
Right.
Not just within the marriage,
Right.
but
Right.
between all people.
Right. We don't form dynasties where we all have to serve the memory of the progenitor of the dynasty.
We don't? I thought that's what plantation capitalism wants us
Mm.
to do. It's like to
Oh, we
celebrate,
do.
venerate, like uh and we'll get into that 2 videos from now.
Mhm.
So I don't think any diagram, like we've talked about Bill Gothard's umbrella diagram, should
Mhm.
depict a woman, especially a woman's vocation, as completely subsumed under her husband. Like,
Yeah.
that's just not what it is, even in a
Yeah.
good, healthy marriage, and especially not in a bad one. So,
Mhm.
a married woman has a vocation as daughter of God. She's
Yeah.
gifted by the Spirit of God to be part of the church and the mission of Jesus,
Yeah.
and she's not to be subsumed into her role as a wife. That
Mhm.
role is important, but it's not everything. One
Right.
of the stories that the early church passes down is a story about Melania the Elder. She was a Roman noblewoman who came to Christ, and after she was baptized, she felt like she was called to do other things. And again, in Roman culture, it was just like you are either an honorable woman and mother, like wife and mother, or a dishonorable one. So the significance of what she does here is just amazing in that cultural context. She actually entrusts her like infant son to another family member because her husband had died while she was pregnant, leaving her a widow. And so she entrusts that child, maybe like 1 or 2 years old, I forget what the story is, but to another family member, and she gives so much of her wealth away and takes it near Jerusalem, and she founds two monasteries, one for men, one for women. And so whether or not every detail in the story is accurate is one thing. I tend to think it sounds really accurate, and it's not exceptional either. The 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 significance of the story is that it was so revered by the early Christians. They passed this story around. This was held up as this is a great example for a woman who just recently had a kid,
Mm,
like, and was widowed, of what it means to be devoted to Jesus. Incredible.
right.
And I love to point out that this is connected to 1 Corinthians 7, where we talked about this in the last video. 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says, I I want that all married couples should be as though they were not, right? Like not in the sense of like go out and have an affair, but in the sense of there is a bigger family of God. There is a bigger mission of Jesus that you're called to participate into. And so I love throwing this, and I'm going to put this on the screen here. Like a friend of mine who threw up Bill Gothard's umbrella and said, "This is great. This is the secret to
Mm,
husbands and wives having harmony." I I regularly throw into the comments like, "I'm curious how you feel about and interpret this in coordination with the umbrella diagram," and it's First
mm,
Corinthians 7:29.
mm,
And this particular friend could not answer this and
mm,
has not returned to the thread.
hmm.
He's a pastor, by the way.
Well, this is the symphony of the church, women's voices in the church. If you're a woman who has strength and intelligence, then where is your voice in the church? You have to be able to accept the gifts that you have, the compliments that you get from them, and genuinely enjoy that, the grace, the riches of our lives. This actually breaks the paradigm of this worm theology, like you're just a worm and God,
Right.
yeah, I guess he loves you, but he doesn't really like you. Enjoying your gifts breaks all of that. And, all of the worm theology is a hierarchy, it's a pyramid, and it's extremely baked deep into manosphere theology. I think that the church should be able to recognize women's gifting and then support them in raising children, in having jobs, and not just feel like you have to choose to be at home with kids and then have like a scammy MLM business on the side, as a lot of them are very predatory.
Right. MLM being the multi-level marketing
Yeah.
pyramid organization type
Yeah.
of work
Right.
because you're just trying to fit something meaningful and maybe, you know, productive
Mhm.
on the side.
Mhm. Right. And there are things that break the hierarchy of marriage. It's not just First Corinthians 7. What if you're single into your 30s? Well, that's a problem in a lot of churches, right? That breaks that whole purity paradigm. How does a church handle personal growth in celibacy and singleness? Well, it doesn't really. It really only caters to families with little kids. What if you're unemployed? What if the economy is really bad and we don't have pensions anymore. We have this gig economy where you're always grinding. And, we've got older people who are saying, oh, just mail them a shoe and get your foot in the door. This is all ridiculous anecdotes. It doesn't really do justice to the struggle that people have, and everything needs to be shoved into this, you know,
Right.
women work for do all the childcare and the man works all the time. We just don't have a way to process more complicated things. And what if you're
Right.
experiencing an extended illness where you can't be diagnosed, you can't be cured, it's chronic, and the church needs to help you. All of these things break the hierarchies that we've constructed for ourselves.
Well, I think that it challenges the kind of implicit prosperity theology that
Mm,
is there in the colonial kind of
mhm.
enticement of like, well, if
Yes.
you just come along, right, like you'll get land, you'll have a happy marriage,
Mhm.
I guess your kids will be fine because you're going to make them be fine, right? So,
Mhm.
and then your life will be just great. And
Yeah.
and I think there is an implicit element of prosperity theology that's comes in the wrapping of purity culture. Like, well, if you just stay sexually pure while you're young and single, then you'll have a marriage that's full of sex without guilt, and your kids will behave, and the US will be great because you stayed pure. And and I do value sexual integrity. So
Mhm.
like, hey, listeners, don't get us wrong, but the issue is the implicit promise that's kind of comes along with it, because that isn't that a part of the prosperity theology of plantation capitalism, right? Like the way
Right.
it deforms Christian faith.
Right. I think we're saying that plantation capitalism, going all the way back to Massachusetts and the Virginia companies, is a false gospel. It's a prosperity gospel. It's a multi-level pyramid marketing scheme.
Ooh, tell it. Yeah.
Yeah, I just did.
So when it comes to the question of husbands and wives and whether there's a hierarchical relationship there, we're arguing no, that this is not theologically conservative. It's actually
Mhm.
progressive, if you want to call it that,
Yeah.
because it is not found in the early church. We don't see that. And furthermore, it leads to all kinds of distortions and tensions and non-workable solutions because of the way that expectations are formed about, like, this is what a husband's going to be, this is what a wife is going to be. Well, they husbands and wives are called to take their union with Christ seriously and their union with one another seriously, so
Mhm.
seriously that maybe other people's marriages aren't exactly the mold that you will need to follow, right?
Right.
Maybe you will need to hold Jesus's hand together as you walk in on this journey.
Right.
I think that's reality. I think that is what we'll find in life. And I think this is the tremendous freedom, but also vision and responsibility that passages like Ephesians 5, Genesis 2, 1 Corinthians 6 and 7 call us into.
Right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. But join us next time for session 12, part 4, the one where we smash the Confucian hierarchy in the church